Hello, my name is Kevin, and in today's lesson of the Hug 360 Chess Club, we will be going over the homework that you had last week for perpetual checks. Our first problem is pretty straightforward. It's white to move, and white's goal is to force black into a stalemate through a perpetual check. I'm going to give you a couple seconds to figure this one out. Okay, now that you've given the problem some thought, here's the solution. White needs to perform a perpetual check or he will lose, because the black queen can move to h2, checkmating white. So, first white has to perform a check. Well, the only move that white can do to perform a check is to move the knight to g6. So, if white moves its knight to g6, then the black king cannot go to g7, not g7, it cannot go to g8 since the white bishop on e6 is blocking this square. So the black king can only go to h7. So now the black king's in h7, we can move our white knight back to f8, and that checks the king. King can only move here again, and we just repeat the process. So that was our first problem. On to the next. For our next problem, it's white to move, and white has to perform a perpetual check because one, he is behind by 3 pawns, and the black pawn on h2 is about to promote, which most likely will promote to another queen. So white needs to perform a perpetual check. So I'm going to give you a couple seconds to try and figure this one out, and remember, in order to perform a perpetual check, you need to first find a way to actually check. Good luck. So now that you've given the problem some thought, here's a solution. As I said before, in order to perform a perpetual check, you need to know how to check first. So, looking at white's pieces, the only piece that white can use to check the black side is the queen on a3. So, we can move our queen to either a8 to check the black king, or we can move it to f8. And the correct solution is actually moving it to f8, and I'll show you why later. So if we move it to f8, the black king can only move to h7. And now we move our white queen to f7, and this process just repeats over and over again. So earlier I said why we shouldn't move to a8. So if we move our white queen to a8, then it gives the black king an opportunity to escape from the 7th and 8th row. So how this works is if we check, then the black king can move closer to the escape exit or the gap in the pawns. And if we check again, then the black king can move to f6. And this time, the black king doesn't have only one choice to go, it has multiple areas to go if it's in check. So in order to successfully perform a perpetual check, then we need to have the other side's king only one option to go at all times. So that's why we shouldn't move our white queen to a8. On to the next problem. In our next problem, it's black's turn to move. Black has to perform a perpetual check in order to stalemate the game, so the white queen on h3 cannot move to g2 and checkmate him. So try to find a way to get black to perform a perpetual check with his pieces. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to figure it out. Okay, so now that you've given the problem some thought, here's the solution. Whenever we perform a perpetual check, we need to, of course, first know how we could check or what moves I could do to perform a check, because a perpetual check, it has a check in it. So if we look here, we can see that the only way for black to check the white side is to move its queen to the B column. So in this case, we are going to move our queen to B5, and later you'll see why. So the black queen is moved to B5, and since the white king has nowhere else to go, it can only move to A8. And we moved the black queen to B5 earlier and not any of the other squares on the B column, since now we can move our black queen back to D5. So it's still in the same row, so that's why we first moved it to B5. And now our black queen is checking the white king again, so it's forced to move back to B8, and then we just repeat this process until we get a draw. The next problem is going to be a bit complicated. And before we start, I just want to say there was a typo on your homework. The knight on G3 is supposed to be a bishop. Sorry for any inconveniences. Anyways, let's get started. For this problem, it's black's move, and the goal of black is to perform, of course, a perpetual check, because black is about to lose if the white queen goes on E1. So since this problem is a little bit more complicated, I'm going to give you a hint. The hint is, since the black bishop on G3 is directly in line with the white king on B7, the white pawn on C7 cannot move anywhere. That's your hint. Now I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to figure this one out. Good luck. Now that you've given the problem some thought, here is the solution. So in the hint I gave you, I said because the bishop is directly in line with the white king, then the white pawn on C7 cannot move anywhere. So using this, we can perform a check by taking our rook on B6. Well, first let's backtrack. So here are the ways. Let's first find out the ways that we could perform a check. First, we could take the pawn with our rook, and second, we could we can move our knight to A6. The second choice, which is moving our knight to A6, seems a lot less risky, but if we do so, and the white moves his king to A7, then our next move cannot be a check, and that destroys the purpose of a perpetual check. And in that case, black will lose. So our second option is taking the pawn on B6. And this is where the hint I gave you comes in play. Since the bishop is lined up with the king, the pawn cannot take our rook, because if doing so, that will expose the white king on B8. So since white cannot take our rook, white can only go to either A8 or A7. So because of that, we can move our rook to A6, and it doesn't matter if the white king's on A7 because our knight is still defending the rook, and then the king is forced to move back to B8, and we can repeat the process. So that was it for today. I hope you learned something from the homework that we reviewed. Have a good day.